please be seated. And for Troy and for Brittany, I kind of had an Andrea Bocelli and Sarah Brightman kind of a flair about it. And wow, you guys nailed it. That was incredible. Thank you so much. So we continue today with our post-resurrection stories in the Gospel of John. John chapter 21, verses 1 through 19. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, and sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the number of fish. Then the disciples whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped in the water. So Peter puts his clothes on to jump in the water. There you go. And the other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish that they had got from far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire burning, coals there, with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some fish that you've just caught." Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many in the net, it was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus had asked him a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." So what in the world do you do when your whole world has been turned upside down? The disciples had seen Jesus arrested, seen him crucified, seen him buried, and now for the 3rd time, they've seen a post-resurrection experience with Jesus, an experience where the laws of gravity do not seem to be in play, and locked doors and windows and walls do not get in the way. Jesus just appears. So what in the world do you do when your whole world is turned upside down? We do something familiar. We do something kind of task-oriented. I know for me, one of the things that helps me kind of to deal with the stress of life at times is I wash and detail my car. It takes me almost all day long to do it. But it's just that mundane task of just doing something that's normal helps to just kind of ground you. So with the world turned upside down for the disciples, they asked the question, "What are we going to do now?" And their response is, "What the hell, let's go fishing." And that's where they go, all night long. Now, hear me now, believe me later, all right? I tell you all the time that the Gospel of John is the mystic, symbolic gospel. Yes, it refers to the story of Jesus. Many parts of the story are very familiar to us, but John wrote his gospel to show the spaces between the words, the symbols and the metaphors of faith. And the fact that he's writing a story about after the world has been turned upside down, the disciples go fishing. This is more than just logging what the disciples were doing post-resurrection. Fish have been called the animal of the New Testament because they are mentioned so many times. And especially in Jungian psychology, it's the fish symbolize that which swims and lives under the surface, that which swims deep. So the fish represent the undiscovered part of our consciousness and our psyche. That part of us that just continues to thrive, but it's down deep below that we aren't always conscious of. But when we take the time to go fishing, we can take that which is unfamiliar, that which we yet do not know, and we can bring it to the surface of our consciousness. Does that make sense? You see how powerful a symbol that is? But here's the catch. Fish just don't come up to the surface and leap in your lap, right? You got to catch them. You've got to search for them. You've got to seek them. It's our job to cast the nets to find out where the fish are. Now, there is a Greek word used for fishing that has two meanings. One is going fishing into the depths, into the deep. Going into the depths and into the deep. And for the Greeks that were talking about mollusks, which they would take the shell, the dye, they would create a purple dye from their shells. So you would find these in the deep waters. And then the second meaning of the word became metaphorical. It became metaphorical expression of exploring the depths of one's mind. So, it's more than just a story about disciples doing something familiar during chaotic times. It's a symbolic, metaphorical story about the disciples casting their nets all night long and finding nothing. But when a man on the seashore says to them, "Why don't you try over here?" they're able to cast their nets and bring up so much consciousness that they can barely contain it all. Does that help you to make more sense of the story? Is that? And in order to experience the fullness of the divine, in order to experience the fullness of our consciousness, it's a process that we have to be willing to go fishing for and also fish at the great depths. Another thing about the story is this. It was Jesus' instruction for them to cast in another place. What's it? Einstein's definition of insanity, right? You all know this by now. Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result each time. And so many of us who have a desire to go into those depths, to have a deeper, richer understanding, but we seem frustrated by the process, and it's because we keep casting in the same spot where nothing is happening. But the glory and the beauty of God and God's Spirit is that God sends the messengers, or God speaks to us in our own mind, our own intuitive thoughts. I appreciate the fact that you've been working so hard here, but why don't you try casting the nets over there? I remember reading a story one time. This man who was at night, and he was under a street light, and he was looking around, and a stranger walked by and said, "Sir, did you lose something?" He said, "I lost my car keys." And he said, "Oh, all right, well, let me help you find them." And they looked, and the man says, "Are you sure you dropped them here?" He says, "No, I dropped them over there somewhere." "Well, why are you looking for them here?" He says, "Because this is where the light is," all right? We might find that we're looking and searching, we're finding nothing, but we need to listen to that intuitive Spirit of God to tell us to cast our nets into a deeper place. When we listen and fish in the deeper water, of our minds, we discover the abundant presence of the divine within ourselves. Now, the next thing that happens in the story, John, the one whom Jesus loved, right, recognized who Jesus was before anybody else, and he said, "It's the Lord." And we see Peter puts his clothes on, then dives in to swim ashore. When the disciples get to the shore, they find that Jesus has already been cooking breakfast. One of the things that Jesus is doing in post-resurrection is nurturing and feeding his disciples. And so they sit around the fire, and Jesus asks them to bring on some of the fish they just caught. So it's not just what Jesus brought to the table, but it's what they're bringing to the table as well. And they sit down and they have a breakfast of fish and bread. This is another form of communion. Do you see the relationship in the story? Jesus is having communion again with his disciples. We know the familiar one of the Lord's Supper before he was arrested. Right? But this is another case in point where they are breaking bread together. Now, in a metaphorical sense, this is a very powerful image. When we eat something, it literally gets broken down and then becomes a part of every cell in our body, right? What more powerful way to illustrate spirit than when you compare it to eating, and the food we eat becomes a part of who we are to such a degree that we can never separate it. And it's the same with the Spirit. When we allow the Spirit to take part of us and we become conscious of it, it becomes a part of everything that we're about. Now, there are a couple of verses that follow the ones that I just read that weren't in the lectionary reading, but I want to add them because I think it helps me to have a clearer picture of what this passage is teaching us. In verse 22 and following, it says, Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, "If you want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is one of those cases in the Bible where the translators are not translating what is literally there. They're showing their own bias. I'll give you another example. When Moses split the waters, what body of water was it the people crossed across? The Red Sea. Have you seen the Red Sea on the map? It's kind of big. It would take a while. You would have to have some really good mojo to be able to separate that much water, right? But in reality, scholars have looked at the ancient text, and it's the Reed Sea. Everybody knows it's the Reed Sea, which is more of a marshy place, right? That a strong wind, Moses' miracle, whatever, could literally separate the waters and the people could cross where horses and chariots would get bogged down, right? Even though they all know it's the Reed Sea, when you open your Bible, even at the most recent publications, you're going to be reading Red Sea. Even though it's wrong, because it's been there for so long, nobody's going to change the Bible, right? And what we see here is a bias toward the belief that Jesus is coming a second time. And that belief, I think, overrides the translation of the phrase. A more literal translation of the phrase is this: "While I am coming." We read, "until I return," because that's what we've been given. But a more literal translation of the phrase is, "While I am coming." Now, I'm about to share something with you that is my personal spiritual beliefs. It might not be consistent with where you are, but especially for those of you who are new, because I say it doesn't mean you have to drop everything and believe it. I once had a seminary professor tell me, "Do not replace any of your theology until you have something bigger and better to replace it with, and then go for it." This is one of the reasons why I personally do not believe there's going to be a second coming. And that's a popular thing. Sells a lot of books, end times. I spent a year and a half in seminary studying apocalyptic literature in the Bible and also eschatology, the study of the end times, because I was inundated with the end times. I was so exposed to the end times and shown how it was about to happen any moment, I stayed scared a lot of the time because I didn't want Jesus to come back before I got to experience a lot of things in life, right? I know that I would rise up the tribulation, but I didn't want to rise up before. There's some things I want to do. I'm just getting ready to go to college, right? The reason I personally do not hold to a second coming is because I don't believe Jesus ever left. Why does someone need to return who was still here? While I am coming, while I am still on earth, I am still nurturing you, teaching you, guiding you, empowering you to go fish into the deep waters of your psyche, of your soul, and to become more conscious of the divine in you, and for you to discover who you truly are as a human being, and for you to live your glory, for you to fulfill your most excellent selves. It seems to me that Jesus' Spirit is still very much alive and well on this planet. Jesus is here to guide us to where we cast our nets. And I'm going to illustrate it now with Jesus asking John or Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And I'm going to show you it in Greek. Okay, so this is the first time. And unfortunately, the highlight didn't come on, but didn't translate. So Jesus, son of John, do you love me? And the word there is the second to last word in the apostrophe there, agapes, agape. Peter, do you love me unconditionally? Do you love me with agape? And then Peter responds, oti philo se. Jesus, I love you, I philios you. Not agape, philios. Philios is another Greek word for love, word where we get our word philanthropic. Philadelphia, city of love. Peter responds to Jesus with a lesser love. So then Jesus asks Peter a second time. Peter, son of John, do you agapes me? Do you agape me? Do you love me unconditionally? And Peter responds the same the second time. Oti phileo se. Jesus, I love you with brotherly love. I love you with a lesser love. And then this is where it takes a turn. And this is where this passage becomes so powerful and transforming for my spiritual experience. Let's look at the third slide now. Then Jesus asked Peter a third time. Peter, son of John, it's not agape me. What is it? It's phileo, philis, phileo me. Peter, do you philios me? And then Peter responds, Lord, and there's your word, gnosko. You all know, for those of you who know, there's a Greek word to know. It's gnosko. It means experiential knowing. Well, there's the word right there. It's the third one, or the fourth one from the end of the sentence. Lord, you know everything. And I, philios, I love you as a brother. Right? What I see in this passage is that Jesus is asking Peter if he loves him in a higher level of love. And what we see is Peter is honest and sober in his response. He knows that he does not have the capacity to love Jesus in that way. Now, this is powerful in the story of Peter in his life and his transformation. Because Peter was the one who was always boasting. If anybody tries to arrest you or harm you, I will put them down. I will go to my own death protecting you. And sure enough, in one of the gospel stories, when Jesus is being arrested, Peter pulls out a knife and cuts off the ear of the high priest's guard. And what was Jesus' response? Put away your sword. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. and he picks up the ear of the one who was wounded and then heals him, the man who was arresting him. Right? So we know that Peter had this courage. But then Jesus later tells him when it all was going really bad. Peter, before the rooster crows in the morning, you will deny me 3 times. Now, Peter had enough courage to go to the courtyard of the high priest's house where Jesus was being held under arrest. None of the other disciples were there. But while he was in that courtyard, 3 different people approached him, saying, "You sure you are one of them? You're one of his followers. You're a Galilean. You've got to be. Well, listen to the way you talk. You're one of his guys." And after Peter denied it the 3rd time, he heard the rooster crow, and the story says he walked out and wept bitterly. All right, so in the story it says, "Peter, do you love me?" The 3rd time, it says Peter was sorrowful because he was reminded of the 3 times he denied Jesus. But what I love about the story is that Peter no longer felt the need to boast about how brave and courageous he was. He no longer had the need to go around pounding his chest about, "No, if you try to hurt Jesus, I'm all over you." No, now we see Peter who was realistic and who's honest and very sober in the moment. "No, Lord, I cannot love you with the highest love. I'm not there." But then Jesus says, "Peter, I'll meet you where you are. Do you love me this way? Yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Now, the reason why this is so powerful for me is this. In all the religions that I know and have studied or have experienced, most all of them talk about how much God loves us and how much grace there is from God. But then from there, they start listing all the things that we must do and the tasks that we must perform and the doctrines that we have to sell our soul to and the morality code that we must live by in order for God to be able to what? Love us. And if you don't, God's going to smote you and you'll be on a spit in hell for a long, long time. Right? Slow fire, slow cooking. And what I see in this passage is just the opposite. Jesus called Peter to a higher level of love, and Peter honestly could not go there. And so rather than shaming Peter, rather than casting Peter aside, rather than doing something punitive, Jesus meets Peter where Peter is. And if you believe that Jesus truly represents the true nature of God, and I do, then this tells us about who God is. God meets us where we are. Our level of faith may be tiny, but God meets us there and loves us and starts nurturing and teaching us. We may be one of the great spiritual leaders on the planet, and God meets that person right where they are. And then those of us who live in between the extremes, God meets us where we are. So our purpose, it seems to me, is this: to go deep within ourselves to find the fish of our consciousness. To go deep within to experience and explore our fullest spirituality and consciousness. And once we've cast into the deep, we know this. And as we know this, what we bring to the surface is so much richer and so much more powerful than anything that we've ever known before. But we have to be willing to listen to the messengers as to where to cast our nets. And when we make our discoveries, then we are compelled to ingest it. It's not just enough to have an intellectual knowledge of. I've met people, I've known people, I've seen them on TV who can quote the scriptures to you. They can tell you everything anybody's ever written about Jesus, whatever, but they've never ever made the connection to their heart. It's an intellectual knowing, but it's not an experiential, spiritual knowing. And what I believe Jesus is calling us to is not just to memorize stuff, but to integrate it, into every fiber of our being and to live it. And as we are exploring and discovering the fullness of our consciousness, the fullness of our love, we can make that transition from philia to agape. And Jesus also compels his disciples that as they are growing and evolving, to feed his lambs, to tend to his sheep. And what I see is this is a part of our purpose. It's not just for you to be able to discover these glorious things in your consciousness, in your spirit, and how you're communing with the divine every day, whether you know it or not. But once we become fully aware of these incredible discoveries in this rich hall of consciousness, then it's not something that we sit on. We don't put it under a bushel basket. It's something that we share. We feed one another. We help one another. All of us are on this journey together. Some of us are a higher level of consciousness than others, but we help each other all to rise to that higher place so that indeed we can make that transition and transformation from philios, a lesser love, to agape, the greatest kind. Thus ends the lesson. Amen. We're going to have communion.